Well, the book of Obadiah is where we're headed again today. This is part 2, a little one chapter book, 21 verses, 630 words, tucked between Amos and Jonah. While you're finding that, I did need to just make a quick statement. I did mention last week during business meeting that I was supposed to have some knee surgery on Monday, simple stuff, arthroscopic, and I evidently flunked my EKG. Didn't do a good job on it. There was some stuff they found. It was not serious because they didn't send me immediately to some place to airlift me away, but I did have to go see my cardiologist, and the result is they think I'm okay, maybe, but I still got to have a stress test later this week. And so I've done that before. It's not always been a good thing, but I did share with some men who prayed with me that I would at least let folks know about that so you could continue to pray, and I appreciate that. So, wanted to do that. Now, Obadiah, part 2, and we've been looking at these chapters, these books that are one chapter, and I want us to spend some time with that. Had some slides, and I just asked Steve to just keep those up there to do a little bit of review. And if you're not sure about some of all of this sort of thing, just to this map of Israel during the time, the message of Obadiah is a message about the land of Edom. Edomites are descendants of Esau. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. His children are the children of Israel. Esau's descendants become the descendants of Esau are Edomites. And the land of Edom, there's the Dead Sea, there's Jerusalem there. This is the land of Edom down here. And as we talked last week, the Edomites were fortunate in that they had an interstate running right through town. Didn't have 2 of them like we do, but they had an interstate called the King's Highway. And they provided safe passage to caravans or not so safe passage, and got very wealthy doing that. But they lived in these mountains, and they had cities up in those mountains that were literally fortresses that almost no one could get to. Now, the time frame is 587 or 86 BC. And in that time, the Babylonians are over in this area. They brought their armies up and came along this way, along the Tigris and Euphrates, came down and conquered the northern part of Israel, conquered Judea. They conquered the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. They took everything that was in the temple as spoils of war back to Babylon. They took tens of thousands of young Jewish men and women as slaves into exile into Babylon. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, some of them. Ezekiel is a prophet at the time who is either one of the exiles or goes with them to Babylon. Jeremiah is a prophet who stays in Jerusalem during that time. Obadiah is a prophet who has this one message. And it's about Edom because when the Babylonians invaded, the Edomites helped them. We don't know what or how. And when the city of Jerusalem was invaded and entered and looted, evidently they were there. And when some of the Jews tried to escape along the King's Highway, crossed the Jordan and tried to get away, the Edomites arrested them, captured them, and gave them back over to the Babylonians, probably for a bounty. And so there is this message that's going to come from Obadiah to the nation of Edom. And that's what the background is. I went ahead and left the pictures up to get to one of the great cities of Edom was Petra. Probably was called Selah during the Old Testament time, during the days of that. To get to Petra, you drive up a mountain. It's in Jordan. You drive up a mountain, and then you come to a visitor center, and then you walk down into a high valley through an area called the Seek. And the Seek is this narrow road that 60, 80 feet high on the sides, 15 or 20 feet narrow, very easily defended. Nobody's getting in there very easily. Then it just continues on for 2/3 of a mile. And then once you get almost to the end, and I'm the styling guy with the red hat, you see the beginning of something, and this is what you see. When you get to Petra, this is the treasury. It was sort of a symbol of the power and the wealth of the Edomites, although this was actually carved by the Nabateans a little bit later on. And then I went ahead and just showed you pictures of people you might actually know who were there. By the way, camels don't smell very good, and they get up weird. Horses get up feet first, camels get up rear end first. It's kind of easy to go off. There were a lot of us there. Just that, and she still has not forgiven me for that picture. Not a good picture. But there were a lot of folks who who were there, and Liz and Marvin, that's cute. They just were holding hands. And I notice your husband's not with you. You guys having a trial separation now? I don't know. It's a good, yeah, I know where he's at. But anyway, but the significant part is Petra and all of the Edomite cities were built up in these hilly Rockies areas. There was no wood, so they carved places right into the rock. And they went up high. You can see just some of the amazing things that they carved, and these were from the time of Obadiah. Just phenomenal the way that they built. And so that's a part of the background. And then if you didn't know, Indiana Jones, some of it is filmed at Petra, and so there was an Indiana Jones gift shop, and I just thought that was cute. But this picture of an Edomite city up in the rocks, up in very secure areas, and then Obadiah, maybe from the Temple Mount, brings a message of judgment on the Edomites. And so I want us to just read through the entire book this morning and just kind of let you observe and see what the message of God is. So starting in verse 1, and we read the first 4 last week, the vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise up against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock. Makes sense. In your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So we talked last week about the pride of the heart, the danger that is. Well, now it goes on, and Obadiah begins to talk about the way the judgment is going to happen. And when it happens, it's going to be complete and total. And kind of is a little sarcasm. If thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed, would they not steal only enough for themselves? Or if grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? And the idea is, when this judgment comes, you're not going to have anything left. Everything is going to be taken from you. How Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. All your allies, well, the Babylonians were their allies. Other countries were their allies. Your allies have been driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They've prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom and understanding out of Mount Esau? And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Teman. That was another city of the Edomites. So that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter because of the violence done to your brother Jacob. Now he begins to say, here's why God is upset with you. This is why God is angry. And he makes the reference that Jacob and Esau were brothers, so that those nations should have supported each other because they were family in some respect. But because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth on the day of his calamity. They did all of that. And God says, that's why you're going to be judged. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. And those are the reasons there. So then he begins to move on to this idea of the day of the Lord. And by the way, in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord is always the day of judgment. And a lot of times it's the great and terrible day of the Lord. Can judgment be great? If you're ready. Can it be terrible? Obviously. So in the day of the Lord is near upon all nations, as you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been. Basically, the other nations are going to eat, drink, and consume the nation of Edom to where there is nothing left. But in Mount Zion, and Zion is the hill that the temple was built on, in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. In the Old Testament, there's a word, the remnant, and it always is the idea that even if the nation of Israel is attacked and there will always be a remnant left, there will always be a few who will still be there, that God's never going to let them be totally destroyed. The other idea is that even when all the rest of the nation is not believing, there is always a remnant who will be faithful, who will still honor God. So that's part of this issue. The house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. What goes around is going to come around. They shall burn them, consume them. There shall be no survivor for the house of Esau. Israel will survive, Esau won't. In fact, Edom, eventually ceases to exist. There are no Edomites in the world today. There really are no descendants that we know of. Those of the Negev shall possess Mount Esau. Those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim, the land of Samaria. Pretty much it means that people from the Negev, who are the Nabateans, who did eventually take over Edom, are going to possess it, but Israel is going to get all their land back. That's what that sentence means. The exiles, those people taken to Babylon, this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites. They're going to come back home. As far as Zarephath, the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negev. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule the Mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. In other words, Israel is going to be restored, but there is ultimately going to be a Savior we know about who goes to the Temple Mount, and his name is Jesus. Well, okay, that's the story of Obadiah. So what does that get for us today? Well, one of the things is, I think, without any question, Obadiah and much of the Old Testament says that God deals with nations. He judges nations, He blesses nations, He uses nations. In fact, you really can't read the Old Testament without understanding that God does deal with nations. If you back up a little bit, 722 BC, because the northern kingdom, Israel, was ungodly, God brought the Assyrians, and they came and they conquered the northern part. They got to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah, who was a good and godly king, went to the temple and prayed, and the people fasted and prayed, and God basically sent a plague, and hundreds of, 300,000, I think, of Sennacherib's armies died, and they were survived. God blesses and protects some nations. He allows others to fall. Then we come up to this time, and God, because the Israelite nation at this time is not godly, they're not honoring God, they've turned away from Him, God allows the Babylonians to come in. And there's sorrow and there's grief. There's things that are going on, but God uses nations. And by the way, Jeremiah and Ezekiel are two prophets at this time. Jeremiah in Jerusalem, Ezekiel in Babylon. They make it really clear the reason the temple got destroyed was because people weren't honoring the God of the temple. God brings judgment on Edom. Later on, He's going to bring judgment on Babylon. In fact, if you get to the book of Daniel, there's this really weird story about handwriting on the wall. If you read that story, what it means is Belshazzar, who was the king, got some of those gold and silver cups that they had stolen from the temple and was drinking to false gods with them. And God started writing on the wall. They brought Daniel to interpret it, and the interpretation was that God was going to judge Babylon. And evidently, maybe in that very night, the Persian army invaded, came through a water spout area, and conquered the city of Babylon, and allowed all the exiles to return home. God deals with nations. Now, we're going to go there in a moment, but let me back up by saying God primarily deals with people, individuals. God knows your name. He created you. He knows who you are. And for the most part, God wants you to respond to Him in a personal way. In fact, it's kind of interesting that, and I don't know why I never saw this, but in Jeremiah chapter 31, there has always been a message that God gives Jeremiah. And I discovered this week, and I don't know why I had not noticed, it's the same message that God gives Ezekiel. They're like 1,000 miles apart, separate. They're not on Instagram together, I don't think. They never Facebooked each other. But God gave them exactly the same message. Well, the message was, Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31 said, you have heard it said, this proverb, the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. That just, sour grapes gets me to begin with. But it was a proverb that kind of said, parents do stupid things, kids suffer. Is that not true? Parents do good things, kids are blessed. And that's just a basic reality. But they were using it to say that if the parents sinned, God would punish the children. And Jeremiah says, that's not true. Jeremiah says, every man answers for their own sin. Well, Ezekiel says exactly the same thing. Ezekiel 18. He says it, every man will answer for his own soul. In other words, God deals with us individuals, which means you can't blame your parents for your spiritual condition. You can thank your parents for their influence, but you must make your own choices and decisions about faith. And he says that's the way it's going to be. Personal responsibility. From Adam and Eve in the garden having to make a decision about eating of the tree or not, and then being responsible for their actions. That's the principle of the way God deals. Well, He deals with nations the same way. And so today, I want to spend a moment thinking, because it's the week before 4th of July and we've talked about it. One of the real questions is it even appropriate for Christians to be patriotic? You do understand there is an issue that God says He wants to be in what place? First. There is always a challenge, and by the way, there are Christian groups that would never say Pledge of Allegiance to a flag because of the danger of allowing that allegiance to become more important than this allegiance. And you understand, if we ever get to the place that we are more American than Christian, we've messed up. If we're more Republican or Democrat than Christian, we've messed up. If we're more with any earthly allegiance than our allegiance to God, we've messed up. I know churches that don't even have flags in their auditorium because they don't want to run that distance. I know some, by the way, who when they say the pledges, say this one first, and then say that one second as a way of reminding what the priority ought to be. And the flag etiquette, if you read the books, say that the American flag should always go on the right, and it should have the place of preeminence. It would be more than a state flag. Or I know churches where they move them around the other way to say, nope, we're giving the preeminence to the Christian flag and to the message of Jesus Christ. I think that's appropriate. But this question of God dealing with nations, And one of the reasons why I think it is appropriate for us to remember and to celebrate our nation is because we distinctly, different than almost any other nation on the planet, really do have a Christian history. We have a Christian heritage. It is being rewritten and revised by people who don't want to admit that, but you cannot read the Founding Fathers, read the things they say, read the way they lived, without understanding that we have Christian principles that have been the history of our country. We may not be able to celebrate everything that's going on in America today. In fact, there probably ought to be a little grief in the body of Christ. But at the same time, we still can remember who we've been. I don't know how many I want to read today, but just quotes from the Founding Fathers. Ones that would just blow you away if you really began to be honest. John Jay was the first Supreme Court Justice. And he said, Americans should select and prefer Christians to be their leaders. Boy, if a justice said that today, he'd never be confirmed. Benjamin Franklin, one of my favorite quotes, the longer I live, the more convincing proof I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without His notice, is it probable that an empire could rise without His aid? We have been assured by the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And by the way, when the Continental Congress reached a point of impasse, it was Benjamin Franklin who made the motion to, from that moment on, begin every session of the Continental Congress with prayer. And within a matter of weeks, they had resolved all of the issues of the Continental Congress. It just goes on and on. John Adams, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. God gave us life and liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of people that these liberties are a gift from God. They are not to be violated about His wrath. Indeed, this Thomas Jefferson, who a lot of people questioned, and he read the Bible, and there were some issues, and he might have been a deist, but he said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever. The justice of God, the judgment of God. God deals with nations. So today, what does that mean for us? In fact, I think it means that we as Christians in the nation have a compelling sense of needing to be burdened and praying for our nation. There's a sense that we are commanded by God, by Scriptures, to pray for those in authority that we can live in peace and godliness. Alex de Tocqueville, if you've heard of Alex de Tocqueville, he was a Frenchman who came to the United States in the early 1800s. And what he really came to do was, he came to try and figure out what in the world made this country be so good so fast. I mean, 1776, 1820, within 40, 50 years, the United States went from being colony, being nothing, to being one of the greatest nations in the world. So he came to try and figure it out. And so he spent, I don't know, at least 1 year, but he just traveled and he went everywhere. He went to the courts, he went to prisons, he went to places of business. But really significantly, in his book, Democracy and America, he wrote a section about faith. And he visited churches. And he made some phenomenal quotes. The two that are the most well-known is, one is, he said, once I wasn't sure how the passion for freedom came about in America, but when I heard the flame of righteousness coming from the pulpits of America, I began to understand. And then he makes this statement, and Tocqueville was not a Christian, but he said in this final statement, America is great because she is good. Now what he meant was godly, moral, honored the Lord. And then he went on to say, and if America ever ceases to be good or godly, she will cease to be great. And I kind of made the casual statement last week. I don't know how great America needs to be again, but I know that America needs to be godly again. And in this passage in Obadiah, there is a sense of the remnant, that even in a day of judgment, there needs to be some who are faithful. And almost as if God says, I will bless those remnants, that small minority. And today, we are not the godly nation that we used to be. We are not the nation of Christian values that we have used to be. But by the grace of God, I think there is a remnant who will continue to be faithful. It used to be 80% of all people in America said they were Christian. That's dropped. Today, on any given week, there's maybe 20 to 25, maybe getting up to 30% of Americans actually worship God in any form or any way at all. But maybe what it means is that, first of all, we as Christians who understand what sacrifice is, who understand faithfulness, who understand the hand of God, we as Christians need to be genuinely humbled and thankful for the freedoms that we have. Do you realize very few Christians in the history of Christianity, even today, have the freedoms of worship and speech and gathering that we have? We need to be thankful. And then we need to be praying for our nation. The simple prayer, God bless America. And the question is, can God bless a nation whose God is not the Lord? Well, there needs to be then a remnant who will say, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. As for me and my vote, we'll try to honor God. As for me and my involvement, my service, my participation, we'll be salt and we'll be light. And I don't know what the future of our nation is. But I do know that if there will be a remnant who will be faithful, there's something significant about that. And so today, I want us to think about honoring our past and our heritage and be reminded of who America was when we began. And no, we're not the same today, but God hasn't changed. And we have a God who deals with nations and who will, if people will humble themselves and pray and seek His face and turn from wicked ways, He will indeed heal lands. Well, today, I hope that you can celebrate our past, and I hope that we can honor the God who makes all nations rise or fall, Edom and every nation that's ever been existed. Let's stand and let's sing.